here.
Right there. Yeah, not for here.
Great. Hi, and good evening. Welcome to Politics and Prose. My name is Andrea, and I am a bookseller here at the store. As you may know, we host almost 1,000 events here at the store each year and at locations throughout the DC area, including at the Wharf and at Union Market. You can grab a calendar of events at our information desk if you would like. They're also confirmed on the website for the next 3 months. A few notes before we jump into today's talk. To avoid any distractions, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. You can use your phones to post about the event on social media and take pictures without flash, but please make sure all sound is off. We also ask that if you have something you'd like to ask during the Q&A portion of today's program, you stand up and address your question into the microphones we have set up so everyone can hear you. We have one over here. I'm being told no, we do not. It is going to be over here by the pillar. And after the talk, we'll also have a signing line that'll form over there as well. You'll be able to purchase a copy of the book at the registers if you haven't already done so. It's how we're able to bring authors like those we're hosting here tonight. And tonight we are thrilled to be hosting Jane McAlevey for the release of her book, A Collective Bargain: Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. A longtime labor, environmental, and political organizer, Dr. McAlevey is currently a senior policy fellow at the University of California at Berkeley's Labor Center, part of the Institute for Labor and Employment Relations. Her newest book continues in the tradition of previously published works like Raising Expectations and Raising Hell and No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age. In A Collective Bargain, Dr. McAlevey shares stories from a wide range of workplaces across the country, embattled schools to hospitals and swing states and Silicon Valley tech startups, to illuminate how unions can help close income inequality, negotiate for climate justice, and end sexual harassment and racial disparities on the job. Throughout her book, there are clear parallels between today's workplace environment and corporate culture that remind us of historic union victories in the past. Having grown up in Toledo, Ohio myself, the daughter of steelworkers, UAW, and teacher union members, stories of picket lines and contract negotiations, and I am so thankful for this book and to all union organizers.
That's right.
And leading the conversation with Dr. McAlevey tonight, we're honored to have Sara Nelson, the National President of the Association of Flight Attendants. Yes, you can clap. Absolutely. Like Dr. McAlevey, Ms. Nelson is a longtime union activist and has served as a leading voice on issues facing women in the workplace and across the country, and has been published in numerous sources, the least of which are the New York Times, Vox, and The Guardian. So please welcome me in joining the two authors tonight.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Are these on? Okay. All right. Oh my gosh, it is so exciting to be here in Politics and Prose, and especially with the organizer extraordinaire, Jane McAlevey, who, should I call you doctor now?
No.
Okay.
Andrea got away with that, but usually it's only nurses and negotiations I let say that word. But anyway.
Okay, because I think of you first and foremost as an organizer.
Yeah, thanks.
That's who you are, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
we're going to call you Jane.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. All right, great. So, so listen, it's 2020, and I actually believe that unions are going to save our democracy, and it just so happens that the title of your book sort of reflects that: A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. Can you tell me why the book has that title?
Yes, but before I do, I just want to thank Sara, while the focus is still here, for coming out tonight and joining me here. I could not be more thrilled, and I've had some terrific people helping me launch the book across the country, and I'm super thrilled that you're here doing this. So thank you, Sara. The title of the book, yes, A Collective Bargain. I mean, I'd say there's two key things about the title. One is linking the rebuilding of strong unions in this country to saving our democracy. Is a fundamental theme throughout the entire book. In fact, the last chapter is called As Go Unions, So Goes the Republic, just to put a point on it. And I'm trying to link the idea. In fact, it was linked really well. You don't have it in here because you're the galleys, but it was linked really well by a beautiful endorsement of the book that I got from Nancy McLean, who basically said her studies of the Koch brothers and their attack on American democracy, she now understands, begins in the American workplace. And total control and domination of American workers in the workplace was where they played out and experimented with how to destroy American democracy. So I'm both trying to link the idea that under the sort of so-called free market American capitalist, totally corporate dominated system, we actually can't, in a system where the economic arena is so dominant in our politics, where the more money you have, the more corporate power you have, the more say you have over legislation, since we're in the nation's capital. I think the only time that we've gotten close to having a more fair, a more balanced, a more just society is when unions were at their strongest in this country. And the fact that income inequality is where it is today is a reflection of the conscious decision on the part of major power brokers, the same ones who are attacking our democracy now, tooth and nail and by limb to every limb they can. Supreme Court, political system, you name it, right? All those same players first set out to destroy what we called industrial democracy in the American workplace. And that's now set the stage for a level of income inequality that is as substantial as it was just after the Great Depression, functionally speaking. And we know that our democracy was far from healthy in the 1930s. In fact, income inequality around the world, by the way, led to the 1930s, I'll just say that, right? So, and we know that the trend line is not just here. So I think all over the world, where we have Modi, you know, here, I don't want to say his name, but Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Johnson in, I mean, all the same dynamics are actually replicating themselves in a lot of parts of the world right now. So I basically argue income inequality is a reflection of a much deeper inequality, which is a power inequality that exists between ordinary Americans and the elite. And the only way that we can rebuild a more functioning democracy is when we eliminate disgusting levels of income inequality, and that's not going to happen without rebalancing the power structure in this country. And I'll just close that by saying, I think, this might be a deeper segue into something else, but if you look with real eyes at the level of right-wing domination, not just at the Supreme Court, but in the federal judiciary, given all the appointments that have happened in the last couple of years. And then you look at the 3 damning decisions that the Supreme Court, an even slightly more balanced one, made around Citizens United, et cetera. Our political system is in serious trouble. It's fairly captured between gerrymandering and money in politics. Our Supreme Court's gone for the rest of my life. One of the arguments I'm making in the book is that we're not saving American democracy until a lot more workers walk off the job in huge numbers, which is what it took in 1933 and 34 and 35. So it's like a history lesson in a title, but yeah.
So that's a whole host of horribles, but you end the book with "We can win."
Oh yeah.
Right? And today it's pretty interesting because in this country, actually still today, we have refused as a country to recognize women as equal citizens. And yet there were a handful of new activists and women who ran for office in Virginia and just got a historic vote today for the ERA in Virginia.
Woo!
So are really taking the hill, right?
Yeah.
Even though people are have told us forever that we can't. But I think about my introduction to you. And I think about the fact that actually my first introduction to you was being introduced by an AFA member at an event in Chicago where I was keynoting. And she handed me a book that you had signed for me, no shortcuts. And she said that she had been to this organizing training with you and was so excited to hand me this book. And so we asked you actually to come and take part in an activist training in our union, because our union, the Association of Flight Attendants that was formed to beat back discrimination, recognizes that we're not doing enough to be inclusive, to build power, to have emerging leaders, to find out where those leaders are, and to really break through the age-old tactics of the owner class to divide workers, sexism and racism. And so here you were teaching 40 of our activists who are going to be working very intentionally on these issues. And I was sitting there thinking, how the hell do we get this in the hands of 4 million people? Because that's really what we need to do. And so you wrote a book, and you answered my question about that.
Sarah asked me to just make sure I could talk to a larger audience, so I wrote her a book. No, I'm kidding.
But I just want to ask you, I mean, this seems like it is written for a much different audience than No Shortcuts was, because No Shortcuts was speaking to people who are in the labor movement and, you know, giving us really the tools to be able to do what we're already doing. It seemed to me, that's how it spoke to me. But this seems to be very different. So when you thought about doing this book, what was that audience that you were thinking about?
Yeah. Great question. I should say, really, the real answer, and then I had to think about it, but the initial impulse for this book actually came from an editor at Echo HarperCollins. I did not actually initially propose to write this. I got an email saying, we have an interest in you writing a book, and here's what gets to the audience issue. I was actually starting work on my third book, which was on strikes. And then I got sidelined into this book because I think the editor herself is a reflection of who the book is for. So she's now 28, which means a year and a half ago when we were first negotiating it, she was 27. She was a rare sort of young editor at a major, what they call the Big Five, major publishing house. And I assumed she was like a pink diaper baby or a red diaper. Who is this person, right, who wants a book on unions for a major publisher? No, and what she was a young person who said, I go out to bars, I go out to clubs, I go to my book clubs, I go to reading groups, and everyone who's in my age group is talking about how bad things are, and then there'll be this idea that there's this thing called a union, and none of us even know what it is. For real. And so I'm like, we live in a world where, most people I talk to know what a union is, unless I'm in a new organizing campaign, and then they're learning it, right, if they're workers in the campaign. But so she insisted essentially that the moment was right, which is fascinating. To me, it was interesting to begin with. In fact, the reason I probably said yes to write it was because it is a major publishing house. And there aren't many of them writing books about unions in the last 50 years, just for the record. So, it's usually small, progressive publishers. So what she said is, we really need a book that speaks to people which is most Americans, who have no idea what a union is anymore, and no idea what a union does, and no idea how a union works, and frankly, no idea why unions matter. And she said, and then they came to me. That was nice. She was sort of on a chase. She was like, I want a particular kind of person to be able to write the book, and we want it to be you. So I actually resisted the book initially because I was already writing another book, and then she just kept coming at the idea that you're being an idiot, McAlevey, this is HarperCollins. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. So, and it was also about like the moment we're in and how do you actually reach, it was about audience reach, right? And I wake up every morning trying to figure out, like probably everyone in this room and certainly you, like how the hell are we getting out of this mess, right? Like every day I wake up thinking about how are we getting out of this mess? How are we getting out of this mess? How are we getting out of this mess? And how are we going to dig our way out of the damage done already to the country? So finally, I sort of sat up and thought, a book that's going to have a bigger audience reach, a broader audience. Why aren't we actually educating millennials and people who aren't in unions about why we matter and what we do and how we work? So I think that is the audience that is intended for this book, and I'm super excited that apparently the few who have read it so far, who have a chance to read it so far, are like, wow, I never knew a thing about unions, and now I really do. So that's really good.
That's exciting, and I have to tell you that you're echoing this article that I saw this past week in Portland Monthly talking about millennials organizing in the Pacific Northwest and getting excited about unions. And the article opened with this 22-year-old in her workplace who knew that things had to change, but she wasn't sure how, and she had somehow heard the word union, but she Googled it to find out what it was about.
Don't trust Eric Schmidt, sorry.
And then later in the story, another worker in another workplace, in a tech workplace, actually heard that her neighbor was a union organizer and went and knocked on her union organizer's door to ask about the union. So she did a house call at the union organizer's house.
I'd like that campaign, but anyway.
And so knowing all of that and knowing where we are and knowing that we have to actually tell people what unions are because they've been so decimated in this country that people don't even know what unions are, why did you choose to start out the first line of your book with unions are such a pain in the ass?
Spoiler alert.
But it was grabby.
Thank you. Yes. In part because of who the audience was, right, which is most people who don't know about unions, but also I'm trying to address, I should say, there's a second audience, and both of them are why I started the book that way. The sort of sub-audience, by the way, is sort of liberals in America who think that we can solve the problem by empowering everyone but workers in the workplace. Just saying. So
We could argue on Twitter.
yeah, we can argue on Twitter, and we can fund all sorts of little projects and marches and things and stand for human rights. And by the way, I'm not denigrating the topics. All of that is essential. But there's something else essential, which is actually empowering rank-and-file workers in this country to stand up for themselves. And that's what most liberals would desperately like to avoid, because it's a struggle about power, right? So that's a part of the argument. It's a part of the argument. But so certainly for liberals who are trying to do everything but reimagine or re-enable workers in this country to have power, they are there's a lot of skepticism among the sort of liberal elite about trade unions. So the opening line is somewhat just, I just want to eliminate it. You know what I mean? I hear you telling me that unions are a pain in the ass all the time. I'm just going to say it. And then there's a second reason, which is methodologically, a core part of a good union organizing conversation is what we call inoculation. And it's about saying what the person's thinking before they say it, and then helping them anticipate what their employer, what the boss campaign is going to be, what the employer is going to say in the campaign. And a rule of organizing for successful organizers is that you simply cannot leave a new conversation with a not yet organized worker without doing what we call inoculation. Like, you literally cannot leave the conversation, because the employer is gonna, if they haven't already, they are gonna say very intense things about the union. And the concept of inoculation, right, is like, what's an inoculation? Like, you give the worker a little bit of the poison so that it protects them from the disease. So I think I was taking the idea of just getting out the thing that people think a lot, which is that unions are a pain in the ass, and just front-loading it in the opening sentence of the book. And then I go on to describe, yes, while you may think that unions are a pain in the ass, I'm going to argue that they're super essential to saving American democracy. So stick it, you know what I mean? Buck it up, like, deal with it. Like, deal with the pain in the ass nature that you've dealt with, because it has to do with whether or not we're going to save the planet and democracy, last I looked. So yeah. And your entire introduction takes us through all of that and ultimately leaves us with, this is how we save democracy. But then the very first chapter is, we can actually win. And setting the record straight about that. And let me just ask you, as a union organizer, when you're grinding it out and you're looking strategically at where you should move in, and they can be very long campaigns and all of that, what happens when you start to win, and how important is it to win, and how important is that as a part of the psyche, and why did you put this up front? Yeah. I mean, I think that there are so many stories about defeat all the time, everywhere. And certainly when it comes to trade unions, there's like, the sort of narrative spin out there for a long time has been, they're last century, they're an old idea, they're an old concept. That's one version. Another version is, it's impossible to win union campaigns these days, though in the last couple of years, I think maybe people are starting to realize, actually, oh yeah, people are winning. So I feel like actually a theme through all three of my books is that all of them focus on telling stories of workers winning. So even my even no shortcuts, right? Like, which is my PhD dissertation. I, at one point in the academic arena, when I was writing the proposal for my dissertation, an unnamed committee member said, you need to compare it to a bunch of losing campaigns, it's academia, and I was like, yeah, no, all you people produce here are stories about losing union campaigns. I'm writing about the winning ones, and I'm actually going to help people understand how you win. Like, that is the entire point. If I have one life obsession, it is that even today, a Now, we don't win every campaign, by the way. When they cheat and lie and steal, that's normal. Okay, they do that every campaign. But like, we don't win every single campaign, but I think there's very strong and defensible logic that when we do the work the correct way, and there's a lot of what that is, what are the methods that we use, I believe that when we do the work the correct way, more often than not, workers win. I mean, they don't just win, they win big. And so I, in particular, this book has all stories of workers winning since Trump was elected. And I made that a particular focus of the book, to try and lift up and highlight that actually I'm telling some huge victory stories in this book, and they're all set after November of 2016. Because there are a lot of very profound union victories happening. They may not get the coverage that we want. I think the strikes are beginning to get the coverage that we want. Certainly the education sector strikes, the Marriott strike, the AT&T strike, strikes are beginning to get a lot of attention. But I think, and I also think that, workers learn to strike and win, and workers learn to fight and win when they see other workers fighting and winning, and that it's possible. And the title of my first book, Raising Expectations, speaks very much to that. So I wanted to lift up profound victories since since Washington went through a rather profound change. I thought I should lift up stories that show people are still winning, despite the odds, when they really dig in and methodologically dig into what are the things that we do that actually enable us to win against stiff opposition. And that's a metaphor for the whole country right now also. Like, we actually can win, despite how it feels.
And then you go on to talk about how unions came to be, how labor law came to be, except that you don't talk about it as a history lesson. You say, who killed the unions? And I think what really stuck out to me in this chapter actually is how quickly you told the whole story of labor history, but and like really well. But also that that you show right up front that while we may do a power analysis and have a strategic plan, management is always doing a risk analysis. And so labor law came to be because there was this risk analysis for the capitalists who thought that they were going to lose control. And you really put that right in context up front. And also what I loved is that you wove in right away the main way that the owner class has kept control, which is through the tactic of sexism and racism. So can you just talk about that chapter a little bit?
Oh, good, yeah. Yeah, I can, sure. I'm not sure where to start. It's such an exciting sort of. I should tell you that when I first wrote the chapter, it was called "What Happened to America's Unions," and I knew that my 27-year-old editor was getting the point of the book when she gave me back the first manuscript, and she changed the title to "Who Killed the Unions," and I was like, check. She understood the chapter, right? Because it wasn't awesome. What happened to the unions; it's who killed them. So not lost on Nancy McLean and her understanding of now domination and control too. So yeah, I think I start out that chapter by saying, well, first I was analogizing. Anyway, I was talking about union busters in the very beginning of it, their origin, where they come from, who they are. And for people who don't know, there is an entire industry called the union avoidance industry. And they do very, very, very well. Okay. All you have to do now, when you hear about a union campaign, if you just envision Stephen Miller and Stephen Bannon, I know it's painful, but if you just envision Bannon and Miller, you're basically looking at whatever a union busting campaign is. And so now the union busters in the White House, right? So part of how Trumpism, because the problem is much bigger than him, right? Part of how Trumpism succeeded in 2016 was by running a straight-up campaign of massive division among ordinary people in America. So sexism and racism have always been the weapon of choice in this country to divide the American working class. And I start by acknowledging that we have to acknowledge, in fact, I think that the big New York Times focus this year was really great for this on 1619. But if we start by acknowledging that the largest workforce in America for the first 150 to 200 years were slaves, you begin to understand just how powerful a division has been drawn in this country of pitting, trying to have white workers see themselves as more special than black workers, and then certainly driving a massive wedge along gender lines. So I start out that chapter by saying, I can count to exactly 0 the number of National Labor Relations Board elections that I've been involved in where sexism and racism wasn't surfaced early, often, and throughout the entire campaign. And so part of I think, why I'm constantly trying to lift up the lessons from union organizing campaigns for what's happening, especially today in America, is because, in fact, we do have to overcome really intense sexism and really intense racism, and fill in the blank, any other kind of division. Like, that is the only weapon they have, is to try and get workers to think that we don't have the same common interest. We're not actually united. And so for me, there really are rich lessons in this book about how to defeat the forces behind Trump by looking at how union organizers teach and enable and coach workers through some of the most bruising, divisive, highly polarizing by intent campaigns I've ever seen. I mean, I've said to people for years, if I say to every young person, I'm just saying, for anything else you do for the rest of your life, if you first do union organizing, you'll be better at everything that ever comes after. Because there is nothing actually harder in this country than trying to help workers win a campaign where you've got, the story I tell about the Philadelphia chapter, speaking of Google, back to Google, my least favorite, well, it's hard, anyway, it's a lot of them, but one of my least favorite companies on planet Earth. They have, there's a big New York Times story because they recently hired a firm called IRI Inc. to start, and there were 4 Google workers fired who had led the protest, 1 here and 3 in California, and that was just in the last month. And when the New York Times story broke, which was shortly after the New York Times story broke, saying that these 4 workers who led one of the walkouts at Google were fired, and then there was a New York Times story that said IRI Inc. had been hired. So IRI Inc. was the union-busting law firm in Einstein, in one of the stories I tell in this book, where we actually helped 1,000 workers overcome IRI Inc. And they had 18 full-time professional union busters going up against 1,000 nurses. That's just a single hospital campaign. And so I spend a lot of time in that chapter trying to teach what we do to overcome the Steve Bannons and Steve Millers that get thrown into every union fight in this country. And I think there are lessons in this country for how to overcome the disaster that is the current moment when you listen to what are the methods and the mechanisms that union organizers use, because we go up against the Bannons and the Millers a lot. And they are beatable. That's the point.
So we do still have the right to strike in this country. And
when we stand on one leg and put our ear to the, no, we do, yes.
And so as you're talking about this, I'm thinking back to that second audience, the liberals who are not union conscious, right?
That's very diplomatically said.
And so I think about, we have all of these groups, all of these advocacy groups who want to change things, who have really good intentions to change all the things that we care about, and some of the things that you've been talking about here. Yeah. But what does your book show these people is different about union organizing rather than their self-selecting organizations that they have? Like, what is different about taking on the real blocks to democracy in union organizing and in union structure?
Yeah. Great question. For me, the key distinction, okay, right. So if we think about the United States and like the broader progressive movement, we've got women's organizations, environmental organizations. We've got all sorts of people doing really great work in this country. But by and large, when we're doing what I call, so the term is self-selecting, which of course you've studied up here. She's got a tab, I think, on every page. But anyway, what I call self-selecting union work, self-selecting work is for people who are in largely single issue, even if the single issue is like racism or sexism or saving the planet, but when you're in the kind of organization where membership is constituted by people who want to join you, like they want to join the organization, it's because they already largely agree with you. So the people who come to your meetings are people who largely, on the margins, you might have some differences, but basically they're coming to the organization because they want to save the planet, so they already believe in the cause. What's radically different about union organizing, and always has been, and it's why, despite all of the unions are a pain in the ass, my opening line, despite all of that, I'm sticking with the union, because a union is nothing more than a cross-section of this country. And the only thing that workers hold in common is that their boss hired them to get a job done. They need money to pay the family. They apply for the job. They get a job. So they are literally a mini cross-section of the United States at any moment. So when you start, certainly a new organizing campaign, like when you start a campaign, it may start with a self-selecting group of people, right? The activists in the workplace who want the union, of course, just like we need activists to start all sorts of campaigns in the country. The difference becomes, given what I was saying about the IRI Incs of this world, the present day world, in order to be able to win, we have to build to something like 90% unity among thousands of people that have no shared political or value-based understanding of anything. Like, they come to work because their boss hired them and they got to pay for the house and pay the mortgage and they got to go home. So what's so radically different about union organizing? And I started as a young community organizer and then an environmental justice organizer. I come from a very union strong family, and I sort of finally found my way back into my roots for that main reason. And the main reason is this: in order for us to take this country back, we actually have to spend most of our time talking to people who don't agree with us. And that's what a union forces you to do. Like, it literally forces you to wake up every day and spend most of your time talking to people and engaging with people who do not agree with you at all. So how you, the methods for how we go from, we have no shared political values at all, we're Republicans, we're Democrats, we're mostly non-voters like most Americans, whatever the categorization are, you've got to grapple with it. And you've got to grapple with how to help people with very different political ideologies come to one big agreement, which is that the boss is not helping them and only they can help themselves. So to forge that kind of agreement takes a lot of work, and it's the kind of work I think we need to do in the United States of America fast.
And so in an organizing campaign, how important is that to have that conversation up front? Tell me about Marnay Payne and how important it is to identify leaders and have conversations with them early.
Yeah. In about 10 minutes, we'll cut to audience Q&A, just so folks know that too. Marnay Payne. So I'm so happy to talk about Marnay Payne. Marnay Payne is a character in one of the chapters in the book. Character meaning, my characters are real people. So she's a character. She's a character, and she's a real person named Marnay, who now I adore. But I didn't adore her quite as much when she was sticking her middle finger out in the parking lot at us. But anyway, and much worse, which is part of what union organizing is, right? So they're self-selecting. People want to come to your meetings. In our case, they stick their fingers out at you. They slam the door in your face. They're terrified. They're scared of the boss. They tell you to go away.
I've had spit.
Yeah, it's it's intense. So what we understood about Marnay Payne, and I just lift her up because she's just a regular story in a union campaign. For about the first week, she came to a union meeting. She believed, this is what I mean about the Millers and Bannon, to combine them, Billers or Mannins or whatever those two are. Anyway, she came to the very first meeting. This was a new organizing campaign where nurses were trying to deciding that they needed a union. They had to stand up for themselves. The conditions were getting bad. She showed up at the very first meeting, but then very quickly afterwards, she disappeared, and she wouldn't talk to anyone. And what we sort of thought we knew about those moments meant that the IRI union busters had moved into the hospital. Things start getting quiet. The polarization starts to hit. And what IRI Inc. was looking for, which is something I try to explain a lot inside of the broader labor movement community and some of the debates that we have about why organizers are necessary, is that the employer in this one hospital hired 18 organizers to unorganize the workers, right? That was their full-time day job. So what they understand is that they're looking for the same people that successful union organizers are looking for, which is what we call the natural leaders, what I call an organic leader. And the rule of thumb, if you want to win a really hard campaign, is when we show up in the workplace, It isn't that we, the staff or the outside workers or whoever it isn't that we are going to identify a bunch of leaders. Even if they come to a meeting, they stand up, they sound great, they give an amazing speech, they seem telegenic, they say all the right stuff. None of that matters, quite frankly, in the science of a union campaign. The only thing that matters is when you hear a bunch of their coworkers mention their name as the answer to a bunch of common questions. Those common questions are things like, hey, when you and your coworkers aren't sure how to get an assignment done or to do a procedure, who is it you turn to when you're confused about your assignment? That's a question I've asked, 50,000 times in my life and gotten good answers to it every time, so I recommend it. That's the beginning of how to understand who the informal workplace leaders are. It's nothing more than who their coworkers turn to. And that often doesn't line up with who's telegenic, who speaks well at the first meeting. Like, there's a total mismatch between those two ideas. So Marnay Payne was a natural leader, and as I like to say, the leaders are there before anyone shows up. The leaders are there. There are leaders in every workplace. And our job is to identify them and recruit them to the cause, at least in the kind of large-scale, sort of what we call labor market-wide, right? I didn't start in a workplace where I organized my workplace. I started as a professional union organizer, helping workers form unions against very stiff odds and against union busters. So Marnay is a terrific illustration of several things. One, she was a serious leader. Two, the bosses got her. They got her on because there wasn't inoculation done, right? Because there hadn't been a really effective conversation with her about all the things that the employer's about to say about unions, which is, we're evil, we steal your money, we put you in jail, we put you in strike jail, we put you in union jail, we're going to force the place to close. It's a very long list of things that apparently unions do, that we don't, But anyway, so they knew that Marnay mattered in her very large unit telemetry as much as we knew it. They got her first, and quite frankly, we made the assessment we could win the election without her unit. So this is just a quick thing. We went through the numbers in the campaign, and we got to the point where we're like, we actually can win this election narrowly, because if you do our work, as I like to say, like if you're on my team, you're going to have to say the vote count by unit before the election in a secret box with your name on it, and then we're going to open it later and see how you did. Like, we pretty much can count which workers are going to break which way in the election because of the methods we've used. So we knew that we could win the actual election without a couple of big units, including the unit that Marnay was in. But what we said to the workers all along is, for you to win the kind of contract you want, and this is an analogy for America too, which we should come to, how do you govern? So we said to the workers, what's more explicit in a union organization than it is in American democracy, because of the structure of the law, is that when you win a union election, nothing happens unless and until you fight out and win your first collective agreement or your first contract, which I also hold up as a mini metaphor for this country, because so often what Americans do, if we do it, is show up and vote and then go home and let everyone else worry about it. And then we lose because we have no governing power, right? We're in D.C., let's be real. Like, who's governing? It ain't us, last I looked. So part of what I said to the workers is, look, we can write that unit off just for the election, but you can't write that unit off to win the power to govern and win the kind of contract you want. So you're going to have to go get Marnay and every single worker in this hospital to win a powerful contract that's going to change your life and change patient care outcomes in this hospital. And they did, because we said, literally, we have to go get her, and we have to go get every anti-union worker in this fight, and you've got to bring them along. So our work is about flipping antis and moving undecideds. That's like key lingo in a really hard campaign. And we didn't give up on Marnay, despite not just the finger out, which I won't illustrate for you. I'm trying not to. But there were also a lot of other really, like if you had read the social media posts that were going on, this is vicious anti-union behavior coming out of whole units of workers, and that's normal in our work in the beginning. And the question is, can you overcome it? And we did in that campaign, and Marnay Payne went on to lead the strike vote 5 months later in that hospital. And now she was elected a member of the executive committee of the union. So that's why we don't give up on people.
And just to illustrate your point about her being a leader, how quickly did the entire unit flip once she flipped to the union?
Became the first 100% unit in the hospital the day she flipped. So that's the power of a strong leader in her unit, right? Literally, it was the first 100% unit. because she was that much of a leader in her workplace. So,
So there's two different things going on here in your book, too. You're talking about union organizing, so building the union, introducing unions again to Americans. And also the fact that, hey, we still do have a labor movement in this country. And
a fine labor leader sitting next to me. Okay, sorry.
And it is a structure. It is a legal structure. It is the only structure in the country where people are forced to come together against their will and have to deal with each other if they want to make their lot in life better. But you know, your chapter on everything you need to know about unions, which was mostly wrong, you know, gets at all the
That's the
assumptions.
title, not what she believes. Sorry, go on.
Gets well. You know, gets at all the assumptions about unions, except that if we aren't engaged in our unions, we could actually make all these things true about the unions, to your point of they're a big pain in the ass. But your chapter on the UTLA strike was not just about a strike. It was about taking back the unions. So identifying, self-selecting the leaders in that union already had a structure that they could work in, and they took back their union in order to have a strong strike and win a strong contract and change the community in LA. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. I mean, there are still basically 15 million people in unions in this country. And by the way, that's a very large organization in the United States. So I devote, one long chapter. That's the campaign I was helping to run in 2016 in the hospitals in Philadelphia. And then the gift to all of us in some ways, right, as people in this country, was also the gift to me at the very end of writing the book, which was that the Los Angeles teachers went out on massive strike. And I remember calling up my editor and saying, yeah, you got to wait one more week, girl, because I'm going to write a chapter about this, you know. So I close the book functionally, and I tell the story of how they rebuilt the union. Because honestly, if we did what Sara has done and is part of and is doing, and what many people in this room, I wish I could name you all, hello, who are doing, a very big part of what we have to do is rebuild a lot of our existing unions. And when we do, we have extraordinary power. So the story of Los Angeles is not that different than the story of the Chicago teachers, but a decade earlier, which is that a bunch of teachers who were sick and tired of a union that they felt like wasn't doing exactly what they wanted it to be doing decided to take control and run for office internally and win. And then out came the 2012 Chicago teachers strike, which frankly is the strike that began to re-raise workers' expectations in this country, that actually workers could win. And from the Chicago teachers rebuilding their union, we got a whole movement of really bold educators deciding, hey, wait a minute. I don't really necessarily like what my union is doing. It maybe is a pain in my ass right now, and it's not fulfilling my fantasy of what a union organization should be. And they did the very same thing, which is that they ran against, you know, these elections internally can be quite challenging, by the way, for those of you who have never done one. There's a lot of entrenched power. There's the power of incumbency. I mean, all the same issues that go on in the American electoral system go on in a big union election. And so they formed a slate and an organization of people and decided to go for it because they were watching the schools in Los Angeles get decimated by Reed Hastings of Netflix, by Silicon Valley, who has set out to destroy the tax system if it wasn't done by the Republicans. Now the Silicon Valley people who call themselves Democrats are destroying the tax base in California because they don't want to pay them. So after a decade of watching more private corporate charter schools being formed in Los Angeles than anywhere else in the country, a bunch of really good teacher leaders said, okay, we may not like this union, but we need to make it ours, and we need to own it. And they ran for office, and they rebuilt their union in just a couple of years. And by the way, I want to say that because that really matters. When we do our work well, it can happen very, very fast. And it matters to say that, I think, because I think sometimes when you say the word when people hear the word organizing, they're like, geez, man, we're going to, 25 years from now, doesn't that take a long time? Those one-on-one conversations, we got to talk to 300 million people. That's 10 trillion years, It's actually, no. The reason why we find the Marne Paynes of the world and the reason why the boss finds them is because once we identify a Marne Payne and who the key natural leaders are, they lead the rank and file in the campaign. So there's a method to all the madness, and that same method can exist in the United States.
So the rise of Skywalker. Good people will fight if we lead them. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. There you go.
Yes. So
we do
I know
that?
we're at the clock, but I have to ask you one other thing
Okay.
because you tackle this book like you tackle a union organizing campaign, and there is incredible structure to it, and I think we've talked about that. But you're also an amazing writer, and I have to say that more than once I kind of choked up. So I just want to know what is if you had to pick one thing in the book when you wrote it, and you got choked up with the idea that people would be reading this story, what would that be?
There are definitely a lot of them, but the one that can almost make me cry still, so I have to concentrate when I talk about it. No, that's not true. I can do it now. It's a story early on. I tell about a worker named Jamie Rhodes, who was in the campaign that I was working on in Philadelphia in 2016. And Jamie, so I had the pleasure this time around of helping run a really big series of elections, and then sort of going back into the comfort of, at the time, my Harvard postdoc for a little while. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to write about the campaign in Philadelphia, about the other book I was writing about strikes, because we had to go to strike in a bunch of places. And Jamie Rhodes had to go on strike to get her contract, right? To get her first contract in an American hospital in the 5th largest city, she and her coworkers had to lead a strike that happened in 2017. That's what I mean. Did you read the headlines about that one? No, you missed it. Anyway, that's after, who wins. And people think, oh, labor's really dead. And it was such a beautiful thing because actually these workers just said, yeah, we're going to go on strike and win. And she tells... So I go back to interview a bunch of workers that I had helped in a big campaign. And that's a luxurious thing. I don't usually get to have the time to lollygag back in and 6 months later just check in with the workers. How's it going? What'd you learn? How's it feel now 6 months later? And I did in this case. And so I sat down with Jamie Rhodes, who had gone on strike in April of 2017 to force a major multinational employer in the hospital industry to get them their contract. And Jamie, in the course of the interview, said that I was asking her just to roll me through the highlights of the campaign for her, where she learned the most. And she went right to the National Labor Relations Board vote count, which I have to say, almost everyone I've ever been to makes me weep like crazy because it's so emotional when workers win against the odds they're up against. And Jamie tells a story that she had this intense nervous quiver in her lip. We asked her to be the observer. So she was sitting at the table when the officials from the National Labor Relations Board come in and start counting the votes. And we always know what the win number is. There's a total number, and by the way, the board agents have to keep counting because, it's an election. But they're saying yes and no out loud or messed up ballot or something. Everything feels like the Florida recount to me. Bad. Chad. Okay, sorry. Anyway, so she's reading the ballots out loud, and then when the win number hit, the number that we knew there was no we were losing hit, she said that she developed this intense quiver in her lip. And it was uncontrollable, and she said she was kind of freaking out because her lip was freaking out, and there's hundreds of people watching. And she said the only time in her life when she ever had that quiver, ever, was standing in the aisle in the wedding when her husband was about to become her husband, and he was walking down the aisle. That's how powerful a union election is in this country. You get the same lip quiver when you're about to marry the man that you've been dying to marry for 10 years, and when you beat your boss who's hired thugs to attack you.
So I think that what we'll do is we'll take maybe three questions at a time, and then Jane will respond.
Okay, I'm one of those liberals that you criticize. But I was going to say, but I was born in the 40s, so in New England. So we were all labor people anyway, and I spent some time working for the mine workers.
Thank you.
I think what is concerning is the sense of the number of union members who went for Trump, especially in the sort of deindustrialized Midwest, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan. The leadership was fine, but the members, they became very pro-Trump even after 2 or 3 years when he didn't do anything for them. They became more Trump. So that's the question.
Thank you. Thanks.
I wanted to ask about the power of solidarity. And I've benefited from that. I'm an activist in a federal union. A year ago, Trump put hundreds of thousands of us out of work, sent us home for his wall. And even worse, there were hundreds of thousands more who were forced to work and not get paid. That's right. And it went on day after day, week after week, toughing it out. Finally, something very unique happened, and that was the airline unions got together, led by your union and yourself, and said, it's no longer safe to fly. And it was that example of solidarity that I think really got us back to work and got us paid.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kayla. I'm the president of the Nonprofit Professional Employees Union, and I actually see some of our members here this evening, which is great. I'm also a millennial, and you mentioned the millennial interest in labor. I always get asked by reporters why that is, and there's 1,000 reasons, from graduating into the Great Recession, student debt, high medical bills, you name it. But I also think that we're all workers and we want the same things that workers have always wanted: a good standard of living, a safe job, good benefits. And so I was wondering if you could maybe just speak about what differences you see with today's generation of workers, but what similarities you see that have always been there in the labor movement.
Oh my gosh, I'm before Jane speaks, I'm so glad you asked this question, because I was just sitting here thinking there's so much we didn't get to about her book, and that gets to the heart of what I was hoping we could talk about. So go.
Cool. Thanks.
I'm gonna let you do that. No, I'm kidding. One, I just want to acknowledge, I was talking about it earlier tonight. The one of many examples, but for me it was a profound one, of the sickness and the rot that is the White House at present, was what happened to 700,000, 900,000, 1 million federal workers every day. It's almost indescribable, quite frankly. So that's how we all got to meet Sara, I think. I mean, the flight attendants might have known Sara beforehand, but Sara hit the world when she did, when she did an extraordinary thing, which was mobilizing some good old-fashioned solidarity, which we are in desperate need of lots more of in this country. So, and I just want to touch on that one before I go back to the Trump question. I was just in Chicago for the book launch with the Chicago teachers, and another great act of impossible solidarity broke out there in their strike this fall, which was really beautiful, which was 2 unions went out together, which was very different than in 2012. And the low-wage workers in the system who went out as part of an SEIU local in Chicago that went out with the teachers this time, adding 7,000 to the numbers, resulted in a 40, that's a 4 and a 0, a 40% raise. So that was the power of the teachers bargaining on behalf of the lowest wage workers in the Chicago school system, so that they wound up with a 40%, not the teachers, the lower wage workers, who are mostly people of color, wound up with a 40% wage increase, a historic, extraordinary settlement. And that's another beautiful act of solidarity. So now to the slightly more difficult question. I would say 2 things, or 3 things. I'm just going to say you're probably not the liberals I'm talking about, to be honest, because you're here. So anyway, and you work for the mine workers. It's not even possible. But anyway, but I appreciate the question. And what I would say, there's a few complicated things. The first is there's nothing that certain, and I'm going to say certain, specific, certain media outlets and the power of social media, which is, I don't even want to call, I don't know, do the media people call social media media anymore anyway? But, social media and very purposeful and right-wing and et cetera, social media, and then some outlets like Fox and Phil, and you can be imagined about who I'm talking about, love to lift up, the interview of the white worker with the Trump MAGA hat on. The truth is, not only is that not most workers who are in unions, it's not even a fraction. Like there are hardly any workers in America's trade unions who actually support the guy. So one is don't believe all the hype. That's just one. Two, and I'll get to obviously there are some, so I'm going to get to that. But that's one. Two is when you really dig into the numbers, because I really dug into the numbers. When you really dig into the numbers from the 2016 election, it's white, college-educated white women who actually put Trump over the top, for the record. So that's a little embarrassing. But if you really get into the numbers, like who actually, it takes like 2 months for them to really distill through the numbers. So the reality of who put him in is quite different than what's constantly put out in public. And really the rich is who put him in. I mean, the super rich and the rich is who put him in. And by the way, if it's Warren or Sanders, they just take a plow, run them over, and elect the idiot again, right? And then they pretend to be that they're Democrats and liberals. That's the liberals I'm talking about, which is not you. So I'm talking about Reed Hastings. I'd like to name him. He's the owner of Netflix, or Zuckerberg, or any number of them. So they're actually people who think of themselves as liberals and are participating in crushing both democracy and American workers. So the fact that there are some, part of what I was saying earlier speaks to it, right? There are some people in unions. There was one in the Philadelphia campaign. And by the way, from the beginning of the campaign to the end of the campaign, guess what happened? She changed her mind. So one of the techs in the same union as Jamie Rhodes, at the beginning, I'm in the middle of a union campaign, and I've got a new organizing campaign where that's a difficult thing when someone walks into a union organizing meeting with a MAGA hat. And that's what I mean about how challenging and interesting our work really is. She no longer would wear that hat, and she went to the Women's March. So that's what a good union campaign did for one female worker in 5 months in Philadelphia. And that wasn't Marne Payne, right, who wouldn't have supported Trump, but who had a different set of issues. So I think the truth is, the truth about the election is so complicated. But, we know that we won the popular vote, and we know we lost the Electoral College. And by the way, we could easily be having the same thing happen again, unless we elect, I think, a non-corporate Democrat to the position. But I think, it was 77,000 votes in 3 states. And my experience of what most people who were disaffected in unions did was simply stay home. And that was the problem. People couldn't pull the lever for him, but they weren't motivated by the person who, in their mind, was connected to a family that sent most of their jobs out of the country. So it's very, very complicated. Those 3 states, it was particularly complicated. And I think, I say in the book certainly that I think that the corporate wing of the Democratic Party is largely responsible, I'm going to say, for those 77,000 votes in those 3 states. So
I'm just going to add one little thing. You have the other question. I'm just going to add one little thing. When we took a stand in support of federal workers, we didn't get one single bad comment from the public or anyone. Because the truth is, Americans want solidarity. And when you act in solidarity and you act on the issues and you take care of other people, that's actually what people want. And so what we did during that time was we were religious about not saying Trump's name. We said McConnell's name a lot. We did not say Trump's name one time. And that allowed people to find their better selves and to find who they truly are and not be caught up in the politics of the moment, but be swept up in the love of solidarity.
Yes. So feel free to help me with the next one, because you were so excited about her. Where'd Kayla go? Where's Kayla? Oh, there you are. Hi. Oh, there she went back. Hi. And then on the question of sort of the millennials, I will say a couple things all at once, which are slightly contradictory, but not really, I don't think, or I hope. At the end of the day, I don't really experience as a union organizer who's been doing it, for several decades. I don't think that there are fundamental differences for millennials, to be honest. There are a set of significant issues like student debt that are very real. That's if you're a student, by the way. That's not most American workers. So, but in terms of the age demographic, I don't actually think there are like substantial differences when it comes to organizing and the work that we do to win the campaigns. you know, people often say to me, oh, we have really high turnover, you know, because we work all these jobs. And I'm like, you just don't understand what the average American worker does right now, which is get a new job all the time. Like, turnover is extraordinarily high in this country in general because of the lack of unions and because of the sort of precarity that's being forced back into the American workplace. So when I think about millennials, what I mainly think about is just how little they know, actually, about unions, and what a terrific solution they really are to the many myriad crises that people face today, which is why I decided to try and see if we could lift up those lessons in this book and make it a sort of a different kind of book that really walks you through, hey, what are they? What do they do? And the reason I tell so many stories about, I mean, Jamie Rhodes is in the campaign. She's late 20s, early 30s. But she's got a different life story, by the way, which is that they hired her, right? She was still in high school, working class Pennsylvania kid, right? The only way that she even could afford college was because instead of having a guidance counselor, she had a career counselor, which is what most workers in this country have in high school, if they have any of that, right? Like, there was no idea in her mind she would ever go to college. So she became a technician in a hospital, right? So, and Jamie fought and changed her life in the same way that I think lots of young people can in this country today. But I don't think that I think the one thing that is more normalized among a younger generation is sadly the obsession with this. You know, everyone know what that is? Our telephones and our face in them. Other than that, which is something we have to break in every campaign, but I find it as common among workers of any generation, like in Philadelphia. I have a lot of, you know, in a union campaign, if you're going to lead through a hard fight, there's a lot of moments that I jokingly call the popular moments, meaning for me in that case, in this role. And the popular early on moment in that campaign was when I got to Philadelphia and the campaigns were underway in several hospitals. And I immediately begged, because I can't force, but like pretty forceful conversations to get all of the rank and file leaders on our side to shut all their Facebook pages down. Now that's counterintuitive, right? Yeah, it's counterintuitive. Like, isn't that a good thing? No, it's not a good thing. Not in a hard-fought union campaign, because what the workers think is they come in the morning and we're like, hey, did you actually go have that hard conversation with your coworker down the hall and figure out how she's doing in the campaign? And they're like, no, but I was tweeting all night about the campaign. And I'm like, that's great, because you're talking to the 12 nurses who also want the union. Get off of it. You know what I mean? So actually getting people to shut, I did. I mean, force is, you know, but force of will, I was like, here's the 20 reasons why you're not going to win if you keep going on Facebook, and you're not going to win if you keep tweeting. You just shut that crap down and go have face-to-face conversations with thousands of your coworkers, because that's the only way you're going to overcome a union buster, is by not relying on late-night tweeting and Facebooking and actually moving down the hall and finding the workers who are scared to come to the meetings.
And what I was thinking of in your book also, as Kayla asked that question, is the fact that you're getting at sort of the new sectors who are organizing, and actually you bring up the idea of all the journalists who are organizing. Do we have journalists in the room? Yeah, okay. So and about the fact that union organizing is also about protecting a free press, and that just because newspapers are not being printed anymore, that doesn't mean that the work or the necessity of that work goes away. And so a lot of times what the union busters like to try to do is to have us believe that this is a different kind of job. You know, this is tech. Like,
you're a professional. This is innovation.
Yeah.
Until we innovate your job right out, like Mr. Uber. Anyway.
That's right. And what it comes down to is that people have the same needs. That's right. They actually need a living wage. They need the ability to, you know, have children and love them. They need the ability to have humane schedules. These are all the same demands. And actually, that's what unites us, is those demands. And this idea that somehow we're special or different, or that the work doesn't need a union, is absurd, because actually the unions are the only thing that protects the work and actually protects the purpose of the work. So we all need everyone doing the jobs that they're doing, and I'm just going to take the opportunity to just say thank you so much to all you journalists who are sticking in there and sticking with it, because we need you. And thank you for organizing.
Now we're looking to our spiritual advisor, the boss of the events. Yes?
I think we can do
one
more set, and then wrap up.
Okay, so we'll do one more round of 3, and then,
Thank you both so much. You started this conversation by saying that this is a global problem, that global inequalities of power. It seems that the solution to that will require building power that transcends borders. So I'm wondering if you could talk at all to transnational labor organizing, how the task differs when you're working across borders, anything like that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. I recently, with my coworkers, organized a union at our workplace with NPU. And I've also been an organizer on climate for a while. And we definitely need a Green New Deal in order to have a habitable planet. And to win the original New Deal, we there was massive strikes, massive labor unrest. And right now we have this small labor movement, small climate movement. And, sorry for asking a hard question, but how do we get into a position where we have a movement powerful enough to have a future? Or how do you think about how we get there? That's my question.
Hey, for those of us who are already in unions, who are already, active members, are there one or two things that we can do that will help out with organizing campaigns with unorganized workers, finding people who need it or who are interested, anything like that? Thanks.
That's like the dream question. Okay, sorry. Yes, like the person you talked about, where she went house called the union organizer. I want you and that person. Okay, yeah, great questions, of course, like the others. So, I would say it's the part of why we're in the mess that we're in is because of a failure, not on the part of all unions. There's nothing monolithic about any unions in this country, like when you say the word union, but we have had a lack of attention, I think, as the American labor movement, to the transnational question for too long. We have needed to be organizing more strategically across international borders at a much larger scale than we have been. I would add that ought to, should have, need to a long list of other things that are ought to, need to, should have, just to say that I believe is true. But the encouraging thing is, frankly, some of the flight attendants, I mean, there are global tables, there are global committees right now. There's a new international committee going after Amazon, and I'm pretty excited about that one. I was at a meeting with a bunch of them in Germany recently. So there are places where we are trying to form a more conscientious, where we understand we can't win this fight in any one country. But I do believe the old-fashioned idea of sort of think globally. It isn't think globally, act locally. It's think globally, act globally, think locally, act locally. Like, actually, both those things have to happen in order for us to win, because we need a strong base, and we've got to think with an internationalist mindset. And I will, on the how do we do it front, I will say I spent at least, I haven't done the exact math, but I think 5 months out of 12 months in 2019 in Germany. And I've been doing a lot of work in Europe with European unions. It just turned to a lot of German work in the last year. Partly, mostly because they decided they wanted to publish No Shortcuts in German. So a bunch of German unions decided to publish my book. So what I can say, having been in Australia, New Zealand, Scotland, Ireland, whatever, a bunch of countries, is I'm now very intensely in Germany, where I'm actually coaching 28 organizers, and now I'm doing it by Skype, and they've just won like 9 huge campaigns in a row in the last 6 months. Is the work isn't any different. Like finding them RNA pains, identifying them, all the same methods that we use here. And I feel like I wasn't sure of that. Like when I first started going out of the US, when my first book came out in whatever that was, 8 years ago, something. When the first book came out and I began getting requests to go do international work, I thought, this is a bit awkward, not just because I'm from like the evil empire in terms of union busting, but I'm conscious as an American about our role in the world, and so it feels really weird for me to stand up in Germany or anywhere and be like, hey, I'm from the United States, we know what we're doing, that's why we got Trump, and I'm here to help. I mean, obviously, like I'm always standing up and saying, really sorry for who we are, super sorry, obviously we don't have it all together in our country, but I come from the unions that are still winning, which actually is a fact. So, and there are a bunch of unions that are still winning, and the methods that are winning everywhere. And that's what I wasn't as sure about when I first started going out and doing work in Canada and all over Europe. And so the methods are the same. And I think, though, the difference is, which is true often on most issues, that I do think that people not from the, we are the most isolated. Part of why I loved Michael Moore's Where to Invade Next. Like that one was so good. If you didn't see Michael Moore's Where to Invade Next, he's done so many films that people get lost, you lose track of them. But that one's really funny. And I feel like in the rest of the world, people are workers and certainly trade union folks, if they're rank and file leaders, are much more keenly aware of the profound union busting that goes on in the United States than most workers in the United States are. And they come at the work with more of an internationalist mindset just in general. So the more we can invoke that in the US, the better. And then climate change, just wrapping stuff up here. I tell the story, I think Sara was alluding to that a little bit, which is good in that fast history chapter in the book. The particular part of the New Deal I lift up is the part that I feel like as a longtime union organizer and negotiator that why didn't I even know? I thought the things I didn't know I should really lift up. And the big one is this. Union density was 6% heading into the New Deal. Yeah, union density is 6% now in the private sector. Right? The numbers were as low in the late 1920s, 1930, 31, 32, as they are right now in terms of union membership and participation in this country. And I quote in the book, somewhere in that history chapter, I quote a speech by the most famous economist at the time, giving a major speech to the most profound, important, prestigious, that's the word I'm looking for, Association of Economists in the country declaring the end of America's unions. They were good for the Gilded Age, but we're done with them now. We have this new thing called the industrial sector, factories. We don't need unions, right? So this guy gives a speech predicting the end of unions, and then literally what happens is the fastest growth in the history of American unions happens in the next several years. And it happens because in 33 and 34, so FDR gets elected, and the part of history that I was ignorant about, so I'm lifting it up in the book, is that we didn't get the National Labor Relations Act without massive strikes. We didn't get the functional parts of the New Deal without massive strikes by workers who did not have unions, who figured out how to build unity and walk off the job and create many general strikes in many cities. I was about to say labor markets because I think of the country in a series of labor markets, but in a bunch of cities in this country, workers without unions took incredible risk, built unity, and just started walking off the job and shutting the country down. And that forced a global negotiation. And it brought corporations and capital to the table because they were scared it was all going down the tubes. So while the union membership numbers seem smaller right now, what I think of as the broader labor movement, which is people who want unions and people who want a better life, is a lot bigger than the numbers of people who are in unions. And what they are doing is walking off the job in large numbers, and we need a whole hell of a lot more of that. And if you imagine, let's just say a Warren, a Sanders, a fill in the blank, one of the non-corporate Democrats gets in there, it is not hard to imagine that we will have to take the streets. We're going to have to take the streets either way. This is the point. Yep. There's going to be massive strikes in this country, whatever happens in November. Yep. In order for anything to change, there are going to have to be massive strikes. Many will be illegal. The biggest ones in the last year and a half were all illegal. West Virginia was illegal. Arizona was. We're having massive illegal strikes. And we need to have way more huge numbers of strikes in order to create a crisis for the governing elite and force them to a large negotiation, which is how we won the Civil Rights Act, how we won the Voting Rights Act, and how we won the National Labor Relations Act, and how we won the Fair Labor Standards Act, and how we won Social Security, and how we won everything that we think of didn't come because this guy named FDR took office and decided, I'm just going to sign a bunch of good laws. That is not how our history works, right? Workers in huge numbers went into the streets and created a crisis that forced the governing elite to the table to bargain for laws that viewed from a risk factor perspective gave us some of the better years in this country, and we're going to have to do it again. We definitely need a Green New Deal, and to get there, it's going to have to look like a lot of the strikes we've had in the last 2 years, and a lot more of them in very large numbers. And then the one or two things that already unionized workers can do is start by opening up your Rolodex. Think about every single person that you know who works in a place that's not in a union facility. If you're in a union already, ring folks up, do a global exercise in your workplace, do a break room discussion every day for a month and say, every single day I'm going to interview all of my coworkers about every single non-union worker that they know by industry. And then we're going to actually start giving all of those names and we're going to make the introductions. We're going to actually sit down with our friends that we know or colleagues that we know and say, I'm in a unionized facility in the tech sector or whatever it is, and you're not. I got this terrific contract. Why don't we actually sit down and figure out everyone that you know, and why don't we bring together some people and talk about forming a union? And I talk about that in the book. The way the Philadelphia campaign began that I talk about that led to 7 hospitals forming unions in 2016 and 2017, was one worker having a bad moment in a hospital, calling up another worker in a unionized hospital and saying, is describing the conditions in her hospital and saying, is what just happened here something that can happen in your unionized hospital? And the cold call into a unit, and the person who answered the phone said, hell no. Are you kidding me? Like, we would never let that crap happen in this hospital, and we have the right not to do it. So telling the story of being in a union and then offering up contacts and then offering your union that you're happy to go do phone calls, door knocks, and talk to non-union workers is the most powerful thing that a unionized worker can do. Thank you very much.
Can I say one thing about, I just want to say one thing. As a pitch for unions and the importance of them. When I started flying for United Airlines back in 1967, I couldn't be married. I signed a piece of paper that said I would resign when I turned 32. I had to get on a scale once a month to be weighed, and I had to be a certain height. If it had not been for the Association of Flight Attendants, which Sara is such a wonderful representative and president of, I would not have been able to fly for 50 years, which I did. Thank you.
I think that's a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much. If I had to get on a scale every month, I'd shoot someone. But anyway, so the boss would be a high risk factor for them, by the way. But in all seriousness, I'm delighted to see people. It's so lovely you're here. It's so lovely to have Sara here. Right, you're staring at us. She's like staring at us. She's like, wrap it up. So now what we're doing, what are we doing now? Right here? Okay, so I'll be here signing books. Sara Nelson, super comrade, friend, amazing leader. There are actually a lot of amazing folks out there. We need to lift them all up. Sara's one of them, and boy, is she a good one. And I'm thrilled she was here, and it's really nice to see all of you, and we can win. Let's do it.